Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our conversation with authors from A Gift of Belief, Philanthropy and the Forging of Pittsburgh. I'm Kathy Buechel, editor and an author of the book. I'm also executive director of the Benter Foundation here in Pittsburgh and a senior lecturer at the Graduate School of Public and International Affairs at the University of Pittsburgh. And I'm delighted to welcome what we hope will be five of my co-authors to this conversation today. We have one of the authors joining us and having some technical difficulties. So we're hopeful that Drew Simpson will be with us on this call today. In our book, 12 authors take us beyond the traditional images of titans, those industrialists who were the better known philanthropists in Pittsburgh's history, to reveal a bigger tapestry where everyday individuals and communities also work together to mobilize their private resources intended for the public good. Taken together, our book offers a more expansive view of Pittsburgh's considerable philanthropy, where philanthropists stepped in and up into the needs of their time to help Pittsburgh cope with adversity and to meet opportunity as well. My colleagues and I present a picture where individuals of modest and substantial means helped neighbors in need, used advocacy, agency, and assets, and where others joined them in using their philanthropic resources to help transform Pittsburgh itself. And it's that transformation we're going to talk about today. In a region known for both urban challenges and reinvention, private philanthropists feature prominently in Pittsburgh's resilience. From its earliest settlements, this was a region that beckoned with opportunity. And you know the litany: a strategic location, abundant natural resources, industrialization, immigration, channels of commerce. All of these things made rich ingredients for Pittsburgh's growing industrialization in its base. But those attributes also brought significant challenges in the 19th and 20th century. Epidemics, economic downturns, industrialization, immigration waves all affected Pittsburgh's people and taxed its infrastructure and its environmental and economic vitality. Today, five authors, and I'm happy to say our fifth is with us right now, will share their views of how philanthropists contributed to the transformation of Pittsburgh. They'll focus on the work of those industrialist titans, on the greening of Pittsburgh, the revitalization of downtown, of the red light district, moving it into a cultural destination, into the interplay of community health and medical research and the healthcare systems, and talk again about the transition of the region's economy from its reliance on heavy manufacturing to a knowledge-based economy, colloquially known here as EDS and MEDS. We've asked each author to summarize their chapter in 3 minutes, and this is a serious challenge. I think the hardest one we've put to them, given the depth of their work and the significant contribution they've made. But then I'll ask a few overarching questions to see how the philanthropy they profiled amplifies this idea of transformation. So welcome to our authors. And as I introduce each author, I'll ask them to be sure to define and address elements of the transformation of Pittsburgh in their summaries. So let's start with those titans, if we could, and Greg Witkowski tackled that. Greg Witkowski is a senior lecturer in nonprofit management at Columbia University. He's trained as an historian, and he brings that perspective to his research on disasters, place-based giving, civil society, and international relief. He has a number of publications attached to his name, but the one we're waiting for is called Hoosier Philanthropy, to be published next fall by Indiana University Press. So, Greg, can you contrast the giving styles of these titans and tell us how they thought about the transformation of Pittsburgh, if in fact they did, and bring us into your work?
Great. Well, thank you, Kathy. Thank you for that introduction and the invitation here and to be part of this book. It's been a wonderful experience. The first day that we met, I traveled by plane to Pittsburgh, and it was my second time to Pittsburgh. So I just asked the car driver, what should I do while I'm visiting? And he immediately turned and said, well, we've had a lot of wealthy donors. And so we have a lot of really kind of cool places, museums to visit and the like. So I was really kind of taken aback by just how broad this knowledge of the Titans' gifts really were. So, there are a couple things that stood out to me. And in some ways, while not intending to, the Titans did in some ways, see what the future would bring. And that is to say that they focused on education, both formal and informal, from a very early era. And it was, seen as an opportunity for self-improvement. And so when I looked at Andrew Carnegie, Andrew Mellon, Henry Frick, and H.J. Heinz, these were kind of the four people that I really focused on. And all of them on different levels really looked to education as a way to create some kind of improvement, societal improvement. And so for Heinz, a lot of it was about moral education and funding Sunday schools. For Carnegie, of course, it was really more about the technical education and then that informal library system that he helped to fund. For Mellon, of course, it really, the Mellon School and that sort of applied knowledge that was really important early on in his life, what of course later became Carnegie Mellon in those two individuals. And then from Frick, there was really more of a focus on the arts in terms of education. But what people don't realize, or a lot of people don't realize, is he funded an education fund early on in his lifetime that he funded anonymously in Pittsburgh. And that led to a lot of teachers getting better educated because they would go through this kind of additional training process. So, that was another opportunity for him to kind of improve locally. What I found as well is that while Carnegie has probably inspired the most major donors over the course of his, since his death, I guess, the Giving Pledge and others really turned to him as a way of, as an inspiration. Among the Pittsburgh philanthropists, he doesn't seem to have had the same effect. In fact, may have crowded them out a little bit in funding, the Carnegie Institute by having already a museum in Pittsburgh with his name on it. Frick, put his museum in New York. Mellon put his museum in DC. We did see a little bit of that kind of crowding out effect. And so it was interesting to take a look at the interaction between all of them. And I would say, just in closing, the one person I found surprisingly influential among the networks was Henry Frick. I didn't expect that going in, but he seemed to really be the one most engaged with lots of people throughout Pittsburgh and expanded those networks to his summer networks in Massachusetts and then later when he moved to New York. So it's a bit of a surprise there, but some nice things to see.
Well, that's great because we were really seeking that interaction to see, did they influence one another? And we thought we might see it in the area where Susan is going to take us, which is the area of parks and green spaces. And so Susan Rademacher brings the story that Greg started about some of that work and Dwight Burlingame and others into the later 20th and early 21st century in her chapter. And Susan Rademacher has authored a chapter on philanthropy's role in the greening of Pittsburgh. Susan curates cultural landscapes in support of ecological, personal, and social health through her consultancy in planning and design, community engagement, and communications. And from 2007 to 2020, Susan pioneered the role of parks curator for the Pittsburgh Parks Conservancy. And before that was president of the Louisville Olmsted Parks Conservancy. She's authored a book on the history of Mellon Square. And Susan, we hope that you'll summarize your chapter and how it reflects this idea of the transformation of Pittsburgh. Welcome, Susan.
Thank you. I'm so pleased to be part of this illustrious group of scholars under the title of your book, Kathy, which tells a story, I think, quite unique in America. The green space part of that story is an exciting thread. And I am going to give you a quick view of what has happened with public open space philanthropy in central Pittsburgh post-World War II. But the roots of green space philanthropy run deep into Pittsburgh's origin stories. The region's natural wealth leading to industrial might, then environmental blight leading to a reform movement encompassing the creation of parks and playgrounds. The city's public open spaces are intended as restorative settings for personal well-being and social connection, but not a single such space existed downtown until 1955, aside from the Market Square, which wasn't really functioning as a public park. The post-World War II movement to imagine the city through its public open spaces was a product of civic aspiration and economic competition. It brought unlikely partners together, driven by a stew of altruism and self-interest. The fundamentals of their stratagems were the same as had been established in the formative era of parks in Pittsburgh from 1867 to 1935. These seem to be somewhat eternal principles for us here. Parks are necessary to Pittsburgh's quality of life and to its desired image as a city of the first class, healthy, cultured, and beautiful. 2, parks were promoted to help the city secure its competitive edge and attract new residents and businesses. 3, leaders of the movement hailed from both public and private sectors, and they relied on a variety of financial tools. And 4, the planners, designers, engineers, and artists recruited to create many of these parks were of the highest caliber. Helping to lay the groundwork for a modern era of park making, the Buechel Foundation was a real leader. They commissioned a 1930s report on social conditions in the 27th Ward, the Woods Run settlement, which called for increasing playgrounds and acquiring land for ball fields. Buechel was a leader in green space philanthropy in many ways, including Chatham Village and support for the Pittsburgh Parks and Recreation Society and other studies of parks and playgrounds. The primary difference in the modern era was a shift from personal to organized philanthropy. Trusts and foundations were now organized to meet the more complex challenges and forces in play. Individuals such as Richard King Mellon and Teresa Hines, along with their families, corporations, and foundations, fostered the cleanup of air quality and the creation of public space initiatives in Mellon Square and Point State Park, including the Cultural District and the concept for Three Rivers Park. These partnerships allowed business and civic leaders to retain local control in the face of expanding state and federal aid to help solve urban problems. So the vision for downtown green space converging with the need to change perceptions of Pittsburgh and the opportunities posed by the newly emerging urban renewal paradigm were 3: Mellon Square, Point State Park, and Allegheny Riverfront Park. And together they kind of trace a lot of major points of how organized philanthropy supported green space. Chief among them were through Point State Park, which actually the work on that began in the 1940s, the conversations. The important precedent set there was the state allowing the Allegheny Conference on community development to take responsibility. So a private organization to take responsibility for the development of a public park, which then became a state park. Also excellent design. Mellon Square came about as a result of the Mellon family and foundation philanthropy to create an anchoring urban space, the first modern garden plaza built in conjunction with an underground parking garage and retail spaces, anchoring 2 skyscrapers for Pittsburgh international corporations. was the first of its kind, very ambitious, and remains really an international icon of its type. And then the third, Allegheny Riverfront Park, with the Heinz Foundation and its development of a cultural notion, which we'll hear about from Angelique, leading to the establishment of the Pittsburgh Cultural Trust and their recognition that without a riverfront experience, downtown and the cultural district, we're going to be missing an incredible opportunity. And so those three projects really sketch out a marvelous continuum. And then just finally, I think Pittsburgh history tells us that acts of civic green philanthropy are best sustained through community-based partnerships that are supported with resources, expertise, political will, and public administration. It is that philanthropic vision that has so often brought these efforts together, and it must be left to Pittsburgh's public spaces to tell the tale of a grateful public realm.
Well, thank you, Susan, for setting the stage, not only for our discussion, but also for Angelique, because you gave us a preview of the anchor weight of downtown transformation in a 14-block radius that she will tell us about. And I'd like to turn now to Angelique Bamberg, who's an architectural historian, an historic preservation consultant, and a writer about the built environment. She's a former historic preservation planner for the city of Pittsburgh and an instructor in the history of art and architecture department at the University of Pittsburgh. And Angelique, can you synthesize your chapter for us and how it speaks to this theme of transformation of Pittsburgh?
Sure. Thank you, Kathy. I will try. And again, I want to echo everyone else, just what a pleasure it is to be here in your company, even virtually. So in my chapter on the cultural district, I really wrote about a threading together of three transformations. The first, of course, being the place transformation of a downtown red light district into a cultural destination, what we now call the cultural district. The second transformation is more of an idea or paradigm shift to a whole new blueprint and orthodoxy of urban renewal from immediately after World War II in the 1940s and 50s, when cities were using federal funds to essentially clear cut whole neighborhoods and areas of the city and rebuild them from scratch, which caused a lot of disruption of community and dislocation of populations and social and class resentments. It was a very problematic approach to the 1960s, 70s, 80s, and beyond, where the Pittsburgh Cultural District really epitomizes a shift to a more sensitive, holistic approach that recognizes that existing communities have value, and those can sometimes be more gradually and granularly shifted and improved and polished and kind of creatively reusing the city's assets that it already has, if you will. The third transformation is an economic policy shift to centering arts and culture as economic drivers for downtown. And after World War II, really the idea of having to think strategically about downtown and what role it played was very new. Downtown had always been the default, but after World War II, also due to federal funding and support of various policies, as the middle class began to leave the cities for the suburbs, downtown Pittsburgh and other downtowns across the country found themselves in this new position of having to be competitive. They had to think about what would cause people to come back. And in Pittsburgh, as Greg already mentioned, because of the Titans, we had this very strong foundation for the arts due to 19th and early 20th century philanthropy. So the city leaders of the mid 20th century decided to build on that and position arts as an economic driver. Really in the forefront of this was the philanthropist Jack Heinz. He literally and figuratively was very invested in giving the city a new symphony hall. He himself was a symphony booster, and his original idea was to piggyback on the redevelopment of the Lower Hill District for the Civic Arena. He wanted to clear more land to make way for a new symphony hall that would be surrounded by a fuller cultural center. The idea was kind of a cultural campus based on the model of Lincoln Center in New York City. However, However, there was a lot of pushback from the residents of the Hill District, who at this point, as urban renewal was ongoing, had had enough. They did not want any more. And their opposition and backlash essentially stalled this plan A of a cultural campus on the Hill adjacent to downtown. So Hines pivoted, and I should take a sidestep here for a moment and also mention that another piece of the backlash of urban renewal that was gathering at this moment, which we're now in the 1960s, was a growing historic preservation movement that encompassed not just individual buildings, but historic districts. These began to be proposed as an alternative to raising whole communities and building them anew. The idea being, let's look at the assets that we have, and if those can be improved and regenerated, and if historic districts can actually provide things that cities need, like affordable housing, walkable communities, and so forth. And locally, the Pittsburgh History and Landmarks Foundation formed in the 1960s and began to demonstrate at the local level how historic districts could transform neighborhoods and be linked to economic development. So Jack Hines kind of hooked onto all of this, pivoted his idea from a whole new cultural campus to what if we could find an existing building in the city that would meet the needs of the Symphony Hall and restore it. So he found an old movie palace from the 1920s in the Penn Liberty corridor, which even then in the 1960s, 70s was very run down. He worked with the Urban Redevelopment Authority as a partner to restore and revitalize it and reopen it as the city's new Symphony Hall. This had become the red light district. So this was kind of a shocking transition from plan A to plan B, a bit of a radical departure, but people loved it. People came, and this encouraged both Hines and the city and other philanthropies to then cast a wider net and begin to work on improving the blocks around Hines Hall, creating a larger context for this new Symphony Hall. And this evolved into the idea of a cultural district as opposed to a cultural center. The arts not just adjacent to downtown, but integrated into downtown, with also supporting restaurants and businesses and all different scales. And this area of downtown is being kind of an arts ecosystem. And then eventually that morphed in the 1980s to the creation of the Pittsburgh Cultural Trust, an organization that could institutionalize this project, keep it going into the future, and work at all these different scales and levels and sectors, civic, philanthropic, private, to keep this goal in the forefront of people's minds, keep it active and relevant. And I think the cultural district is never finished. So that's kind of where we are today. We have a cultural district that everyone recognizes and enjoys, and it's still a work in progress under the umbrella of the Cultural Trust.
Well, thank you, because what I've heard so far from the three presentations is this continuing thread of health, whether it's through education or placemaking. And now I'd like to turn to Andrew Simpson, who's written about the topic of health, healthcare, its systems, and its provisions as a way to transform Pittsburgh. And Andrew Simpson is an associate professor, he's just gotten tenure, so congratulations. An associate professor in the Department of History at Duquesne University. His first book, The Medical Metropolis, Healthcare and Economic Transformation in Pittsburgh and Houston, was published in 2019. And Drew, we hope that you'll summarize your chapter and how the proponents of healthcare and its systems and research amplified this notion of the transformation of Pittsburgh.
Well, thank you, Kathy. And I also want to apologize for popping in a couple minutes late. You'd think after 2 years, I'd know how to work Zoom in the middle of a pandemic, but challenges still abound. I'm just delighted to be here. I'm delighted to see my fellow authors virtually. And thank you. So too often when we frame the story about the emergence of healthcare as kind of a dominant economic paradigm in Pittsburgh, we tell it as a story of either sort of sudden emergence or that it's simply inevitable in the wake of Steele's collapse. And while portions of this are certainly true in the popular narrative and really make a compelling story for understanding Rust Belt transformation, the reality, and this is the historian in me speaking, the reality is, of course, the story is more complex. And of course, the chronology is much longer.
Mhm.
Pittsburgh became a model for building a global eds and meds economy, but this wasn't a preordained idea. And in fact, it's really the result of a lot of decisions that are both big and small decisions. And many of these decisions were made by philanthropists and individual philanthropies. And this is really kind of what I attempt to explore in my contribution to this volume. So my chapter focuses largely on the story of 20th century health philanthropy in Pittsburgh. And I should note that there's lots of other great focus on earlier health philanthropy in this volume. So if you're interested, please make sure to check it out. But I sort of divide my contribution into three eras that roughly overlap. And they largely kind of correspond with sort of what I think are the real changes in the goals and objectives of health-related giving. The first era is an era that we can term the era of institution building. And that's roughly from about 1900 to around the 1960s. And the second era is an era that we can term kind of an era of activist health philanthropy from about the 1960s through the 1970s. And the third era is an era of a new type of emerging health philanthropy from the mid-1970s forward that really reaches its fullest expression by the 1990s. And why this seems like a really nice, clear chronology, the reality is all three of these eras overlap and are often really dependent on the priorities of individual donors. And so I'd like to take a minute just to kind of summarize what the highlights of each of these sort of three eras look like and how this relates to economic transformation. If we think about that first era, that era of institution building, a critical goal of individual philanthropists and philanthropies at this point in time is supporting the growth of a health-related infrastructure. And in particular, the Mellon family are really some of the most important actors, both through their philanthropic organizations, which are giving millions of dollars to build hospitals and to build the University of Pittsburgh Medical School, but also through their time. And I think it's important here to note the personal involvement of Alan Scaife, who was instrumental in building the medical center through his work with the University of Pittsburgh. But really what the guiding sort of philosophy was in this era is that strong healthcare institutions help to build a healthy workforce, which help to maintain a healthy city. It's also important to note that building a medical center and strong hospitals was also an important symbolic marker that Pittsburgh had arrived and was a city of consequence. In addition to sort of just funding the growth of institutions, philanthropists also helped to really build out the programming that happened at those institutions as well. And so the Mellons and others were instrumental in trying to build a full-time faculty at the University of Pittsburgh Medical Center and their medical school, which was, again, another major marker of really achieving status as an institution of consequence, as well as supporting biomedical research. Private support for biomedical research in Pittsburgh probably achieved its fullest expression and certainly its most famous moment with the support of Jonas Salk and the polio vaccine. But it's important to note that Pittsburgh was actually a leading center for other types of polio research, as well as a number of other areas like industrial medicine, which was often supported with philanthropic dollars. In the 1960s, that second era, changing perceptions of health linked in part to civil rights, but also linked to broader expectations of American affluence, helped to redefine the role of some healthcare philanthropists and philanthropic organizations. Redefining health in a more broad way helped to open the door for new programs. And here I focus on the Maurice Falk Medical Fund, and particularly programs like Freedom House Ambulance Service, which linked better physical health outcomes for communities with better economic health outcomes for African Americans through health-related job training. The Falk Medical Fund also supported efforts to diversify the student body at the University of Pittsburgh Medical School and to promote health career training for minority students. Another area that I focus on in this era of activist philanthropy is the support of the Falk Medical Fund for mental health and addiction services as well. The chapter closes by paying attention to the larger changes in healthcare financing and healthcare delivery and how those from the 1970s onward reshaped philanthropic priorities. And some of the highlights of this section include an examination of the Health Education Center and their work in promoting preventative care, health education broadly, and in particular, their work on promoting the health of older adults in the region, which by the 1980s became a priority as Pittsburgh's region, the demographics of the Pittsburgh region were changing. I also examined the work in this section of the Jewish Healthcare Foundation and their support for AIDS patients, how they work to address issues of patient safety, and to think about how a long-term healthcare workforce is built and sustained in the region. So I'll close by just saying this was really a fun chapter to write. I really enjoyed it. I'm indebted not just to all of the great archives that are here in the region that have preserved these records, but in particular, I'm really thankful for the opportunity to meet a number of the participants who were a part of this story. And they graciously opened up their homes to me. We sat down and had conversations. They went through their basements and their attics and found records that many of them have now been donated and are available for other researchers. But it was a really wonderful part of this chapter and a great experience. And I'm just delighted that I get to expand on the work that I've done and also really tell the story of how philanthropy has helped to shape economic development in Pittsburgh. So thank you all.
Well, thank you, Drew. I really appreciate that. And I think each of us has our own story about rummaging through attics or basements, or in fact, tracking down participants where we could find them in our stories. Although, Greg, you didn't have the luxury of that. Many of us did, in fact, talk to people who were at the table or in the room, as they say. Transformation in Pittsburgh is often linked to economic transitions. You've kind of heard that sub-theme throughout some of what our colleagues have shared already. But Bob Gleeson tackled this subject head-on in his essay. And Robert Gleeson serves as professor and Albert A. Levin Chair of Urban Studies and Public Service at Cleveland State University's Goodman Levin College of Urban Affairs. He had previously served as Vice President of Policy Research and Chair in Policy Research at the Public Policy Institute of California. And he has had other positions, including as founder and executive director of Carnegie Mellon's University Center for Economic Development. Bob, in your chapter summary, can you address how this topic, your own topic, sheds light on the definition of transformation in ways that really help to change Pittsburgh?
Well, sure, Kathy, and thanks for organizing this. And it's really great to see everyone. Again, we've been working on this volume for a long time with a lot of heart, because we all care about Pittsburgh, and it is a fascinating city, and it's a city that has a lot to say to larger trends in the U.S. And elsewhere in the developed world. One of the topic that I looked at is for example, Greg mentioned when he first came to Pittsburgh, he gets into a cab, and the cabbie says, "Hey, all these titans have given all this money." Well, Pittsburgh is a place where people have become accustomed to the idea that our local foundations, and especially the ones with big names on them, are sort of routinely involved in something that we call economic development philanthropy. Right? We support all sorts of human service programs and charitable giving that try to improve the lives for people who face great vulnerabilities and great barriers to their success. Right? But economic development philanthropy is another kind of animal that happens around the country a lot now. So what I tried to look at in this chapter was, well, when did this type of philanthropy begin in Pittsburgh? Because I think that's part of how did philanthropy across the country move into this area of economic development philanthropy. And it's useful to say that the big names that are on those funds, the Carnegies, the Fricks, the Heinzes, the Mellons, they didn't earn their wealth by getting a boost from philanthropic sources at any point in the way. Andrew Carnegie argued that the greatest challenge that he faced, or he thought the world faced, was how to manage the huge amounts of wealth that had been accumulated in the cutthroat, rough and tumble, social Darwinism world of industrial capitalism. And they were not exactly thinking that, gee, they're going to use their wealth to encourage other people to get into business. It's like the philanthropy was not about how you make money. Philanthropy was what you do with it once you've made it. And they were strong believers in the free enterprise system and let it roll. and then maybe use philanthropy to clean it up afterwards, or keep things hanging together, given the consequences of the way wealth was created. Well, today we see a lot of foundations in Pittsburgh and other places now that are saying, how can we strategically invest charitable resources in different ways that culminate by having people generally pretty well privileged, well-educated, yes, otherwise successful people be able to move into entrepreneurial activities, into the private enterprise system to create new jobs and new economy. And it's like, well, gee, how did that happen? Well, as the chapter goes, it says, well, it really didn't happen until we had this civic crisis that people who've been in Pittsburgh for a long time certainly know, in the 1970s and early 1980s, when this enormously complex, historically important center of Second Industrial Revolution, large industrial enterprises, which created the milieu of Pittsburgh, suddenly, unexpectedly, rolled over and died. And the consequences of this just rippled through the community left and right. And many of the foundations, like everybody else at Pittsburgh, were accustomed to, well, let's go to our leading sort of business organization and community organization, Allegheny Conference and other types. And there must be a solution here, because the titans who had built this region are clearly facing crises and can be the source of its regeneration, right? So the foundations had already begun involving themselves with elite planning organizations like the Allegheny Conference, not to regenerate the economy, but to be more strategic about how to improve the conditions of life for people for whom the economy was not yet working. Right, and had been involved in that for a while. But then when all of a sudden the pillars fell out, they were at the table. And over the chapter goes into some detail on it. I want to keep it within 3 minutes. I have a bet that I can do this. But what happened in the end was, when it became painfully clear to the foundations that were at the table thinking about the region's future, it became painfully clear that the titans of the Pittsburgh's economy were no longer going to be pursuing the growth of their core organizations by restructuring or reinvigorating the Pittsburgh economy. It was not in their business plan. It made no sense to them, and it made no sense to the generation of professional managers who were then managing those enterprises. They were engaged in deindustrializing. I did use a word that I often don't like, but they were in the process of growing elsewhere and getting into other things. And Pittsburgh was no longer going to be a major part of where they would make money in the future. Well, our book is called A Gift of Belief, right? Well, the agents at that critical time who seem to have had the greatest fidelity to the belief that the region could be revitalized through the actions and agency of private enterprise, seem to be the foundation executives who were at those boards, who were at those tables, who began experimenting. And it was hard to do, because it's an odd thing to do, to use charitable dollars to help, educated, computer science students or robotics students or biomedical students at Pitt or other people at Carnegie Mellon. Like, how do we get these otherwise very privileged people and how do we get them into businesses where we hope they become millionaires and billionaires and make a lot of jobs around here? That's kind of an odd thing for charitable dollars to do. So they were very cautious. It took them a long time. It took 10 years or so. And they also were not willing to step too heavily on the toes of the major corporate leaders whose corporation headquarters were often going to stay here and were still going to be big titans in the local politics, but clearly their businesses were not going to be the source of regeneration. So what got unlocked after about 10 years of experiment and back and forth and trying and evolution of larger politics and the civic politics, of what got unlocked was this really creative period where lots and lots of people who saw opportunities to create a new economy around different types of advanced technology, but the medical, the robotics, the computer science, the engineering coming out of our universities, they suddenly found that they could get seed dollars to start these types of intermediary economic development nonprofit agencies in order to help make that work. Now that was the origin of economic development philanthropy in our region. Now, what we don't know yet is exactly, because we know that the economy has changed a lot since then, but we don't yet know, and it's the work I'm working on right now, is to what extent did those organizations actually yield the kind of results we're seeing in Pittsburgh today? That we don't know. And we also don't know, we've only begun to do histories of economic development philanthropy in other places. So that's work to be done. So I hope that's a helpful summary.
I think it's very, very helpful. Thank you. And I think what we hear across each of these topics, and I really applaud you all for the work you've done and these rich summaries, is this sense of where philanthropy stepped in with its unique assets, but where it partnered with public actors. And that whole idea of public-private partnership is a big part of the Pittsburgh narrative. And what I want to ask you about is it a legitimate part of the narrative of your work? And if so, meaning, was it a central piece of what occurred in your chapters? And would there be one or two qualities you would elevate that illustrate this kind of public-private partnership in Pittsburgh using philanthropy, the power of government and the corporate sector? So Angelique, I'd like to turn to you to start us off, and then Susan, to just sort of go around quickly to have you reflect on one takeaway we might have from your chapter about the nature of these public-private partnerships.
Yeah, sure. What really struck me in thinking about the respective roles and then the combined roles of public and private entities in the cultural district was the kind of endurance of Pittsburgh's family foundations, and how, even though government is a very durable institution, it's certainly subject to changes in administration. And because the cultural district was a project that had such a long timeline, there were certain mayoral administrations that had more of an emphasis on revitalizing downtown, and then other administrations that kind of retreated from downtown as a priority and were more interested in neighborhood and community revitalization. So as those forces ebbed and flowed, really a constant over this long time horizon of the cultural district's development was the Heinz endowments. And then as the cultural district gained momentum and they brought in other foundation investors, they were able to be much more consistent and patient with this, supporting this goal, and to work with government as these administrations kind of came and went as a long-term partner. So philanthropy was able to be at the same time very patient and to absorb a long time horizon. They were also in some cases able to act much more quickly than government. Government is famously a very kind of large and sluggish institution that is not very nimble and able to make quick changes on a dime. The Heinz Endowments was, the Mellon Foundation as it came on board was, the Benedum Foundation was, they were at liberty to make these quick decisions as market forces changed and as they saw opportunities. So this combination of being able to both be patient and be very nimble and agile, while at the same time working with government as it changed and kind of lurched and righted itself, was a real strength of this partnership that was formed around the cultural district.
Great. Susan, a takeaway from you about the nature of public-private partnership you found or wrote about in your chapter.
One of the elements of the transformation that really emerged in this latter part of the 20th century was the concern for ongoing stewardship, care, and maintenance, kind of to the point of programming. And one particular example, Mellon Square, with the Richard King Mellon Foundation and other foundations as well, with their support. Foundations can take the very long view. City governments take probably the shortest view, which is the ribbon cutting. And the private organizations and partners are stuck somewhere in that uncomfortable between space. And I think that this reckoning with the reality of partnerships and failures of certain expected roles. So the example is a formal agreement for Mellon Square for maintenance by the city, a maintenance committee, a lot of oversight for a few years, and then the formal agreement just was ignored. And the park deteriorated, was redone in the 80s, again with philanthropic money, but I think maybe a little irritation. And then the same promise and the same failure to perform. And so then the third time around, the Parks Conservancy was asked and partnered with many, critical organizations to do a plan for the square. And the most important part of that plan, frankly, is the ongoing maintenance, management, stewardship, which is still not resolved entirely to my satisfaction, but it did establish a precedent for the Conservancy's projects of creating dedicated maintenance funding, and a more clear-eyed understanding of what you can count on the city to do, which is fairly simple because they've got their hands full, and what the private partner can bring. And then I think along with that, the other thing I would just point out is the delicacy of decision-making among all those parties.
Greg, I want to go back in time to your era with the Titans and this idea of the interaction with government and public-private partnerships, because Susan talked about maintenance, and I'm thinking of Carnegie and the libraries. And could you talk a little bit about how these dynamics played out maybe in that example?
Sure, yeah. So a couple of things I think that's interesting about libraries. We tend to see them now as just repositories of books. You go in, you get your books, and and perhaps even more recently, they're places where you have access to the internet, and so they become kind of community oriented as well. But historically, they also had that community orientation, right? And I think that's something to keep in mind. They used to have sort of displays of artifacts and things like that. So it was almost a mixture of a museum and a library. And so an opportunity for kind of informal education by seeing displays, by taking out books and the like. So Carnegie, one of the innovations that he had was to create buy-in for all communities. He would ask that the funding for the libraries he would provide the building, but the funding for the maintenance and upkeep would come, and the land would come from the local community. And so this created a kind of immediate public-private partnership. And so in Pittsburgh, it was a little bit different setup than in many of the other places where he set up libraries. Most of those were in kind of rural areas that had not yet developed a library system. And, it was a real benefit for them to get this library and to kind of create it. But it, globally set up 2,500 libraries. So it's really an amazing accomplishment that he was able to do through his philanthropy. And as you say, it built in immediately this partnership with the local community, making sure that those libraries would then be used and would be essentially community centers, because they would have the buy-in from the local community there as well, community leaders and government.
And I suspect that these dynamics played out differently, Drew, in your chapter than in Bob's. So Drew, can I turn to you? Do you have a key takeaway about how these public-private partnerships operate? I know there are several you talk about, but could you elevate just one and reflect on that and some, an interesting component of it?
Absolutely. And I think that it really is an important distinction between Bob's work and my work, is that the sort of interaction with government in many ways is less so in the health side of it. We see philanthropies interacting with organizations like the University of Pittsburgh, other private organizations. There are some moments where, of course, Freedom House is a great example of the city interacting with an ambulance service, which is also interacting with an organization that's being funded by philanthropy. I think one thing that's also important to note is elected officials are really happy to promote a narrative about healthcare and economic transformation, even if they're not so much always directly involved in it. That obviously changes as we get into the 1990s and we set up that sort of changing relationship over issues of taxation and community contribution, which is a whole nother part of the story that maybe philanthropy isn't as involved in, but certainly relates to that relationship between community and health.
Bob, how about you? How do you see these public-private partnerships? I mean, they certainly move forward in the era you covered.
Oh, sure. And it's important to make the distinction because the public side of a public-private partnership has many different faces in our federal structure. And indeed, in those 1980s, especially when a lot of those early experiments were going on, the local foundations in town who organized themselves around this notion of advanced technology economic development, that was their sweet spot in receiving political and community acceptance for this odd role that they began to play. They found relatively little partnership early years with the city of Pittsburgh. The mayor was still focused on keeping downtown. Remember, this was Renaissance 2. There was construction going on, and that was already an immediate focus. The county government was very, very distracted. The county government focused a lot of effort in making sure that all those steel mill sites in the Mon Valley did not end up in the hands of the municipalities through the Steel Valley Authority. And Tom Forrester was very enamored with the idea of building sort of a suburban job center out around the airport. Right, so advanced technology entrepreneurship was not fundamental to either of those things. Federal government federal government's always had a hard time dealing with transitions around the country. So the biggest partner, it turned out, was the state government. And I think that's when you go back in time, civic leaders in Pittsburgh have often found their most successful local partnerships are with state government. At that time, it was Governor Thornburg and his advanced technology centers, which gave a great deal of public acceptance for putting public tax dollars into efforts to encourage well-educated, privileged people to become entrepreneurs. So the foundations were able to sort of live under that political umbrella of acceptance, and they became very important partners in funding a lot of those early centers.
You know, we've been talking about the public as it is represented by government officials, regulators, et cetera. And yet there's a more current view of public-private partnerships, which actually has stakeholders at the community level involved. And each of your chapters does have a component of that. I didn't want to lose that. It's a much more contemporary view of philanthropy. And there was some evidence of involvement of stakeholders and beneficiaries of philanthropy in our previous discussion. But is there one example that you might do, and I'll be quick in going around the horn, where the community voice was interacting and brought forward and really did influence the way philanthropists proceeded in your chapter? Angelique, the community voice in your chapter.
Yes, well, absolutely. I mean, as I said in my summary, my chapter really begins with the failure of one idea being the impetus for creating a new idea and charting a new course. And the reason that the idea of this cultural campus in the Hill District failed was the uprising of citizens who did not want it and had a different vision for their own community. However, they were not participating in an officially sanctioned public participation process. They were protesting despite the lack of such a process. And really, I think it was that kind of conflict over the ideas of the very powerful and the very moneyed about what to do with cities, which may have been well-intentioned and may have had mixed intentions, versus the ideas of the people who lived in those communities, who may have had less money and less power, but were actually the residents and the owners in the true sense of the communities, that gave rise to a whole network of kind of a whole apparatus of public process that then grew and evolved over the second half of the 20th century. And really, this is administered through, this is another important role of government. City government and all levels of government, they are really the stewards of public process, making sure that the decisions that are made in one sector and one office have accountability to different sectors, and most importantly, to the community of people who will be impacted by those decisions and by the transformations that are happening. And some people tend to see that as a very cumbersome process that elongates timelines and is inefficient, but efficiency is not the primary goal sometimes. Public process can be inefficient, it can be messy, but it's very necessary to make sure that the transitions that communities go through actually serve those communities well in the long term.
Good. I'm mindful of the clock, which is the worst sort of curb on our discussion here. But I wonder if one other of you wanted to talk about this idea of community voice and how it played out in your chapter. Go ahead, Drew.
I didn't want to interrupt Susan if Susan wants to go. I was just going to briefly say, I think so much of that era of activist health philanthropy in my chapter is driven by community expressing a need to address certain priorities, whether it's drug treatment, whether it's economic development. And that's really an important moment as we see where the community in Pittsburgh is also working to sort of imbue their own voices into the healthcare infrastructure.
And Greg, did I see your hand go up?
Yeah, I was just going to mention briefly, one of the biggest ways to measure the community voice actually came from foundation funding externally from Pittsburgh, right? So that's a lot of times the biggest ideas come from outside. And the Russell Sage Foundation funded the Pittsburgh survey. And, through that, one was able to see the great disparities of wealth and need that were created through the Industrial Revolution. And so, what happened in Pittsburgh and how we had, on the one hand, this tremendous wealth, but also how we saw, how that was affecting everyday individuals. And so it wasn't so much grassroots organizing, but it was a real accountability and sort of feedback mechanism for many different people.
Susan, I saw your hand.
Yes, I just want to say that for the downtown green space projects, they were all led by the classic master designer or master design team, with not the kind of participation that we expect today the community to have. However, the rehabilitation projects, restoration projects for Point State Park and Mellon Square, both adopted the more current practices of both stakeholder, key voices and random user voices, and lots of different methods of outreach to determine what people's true needs are and what their perceptions are. So it's a different ballgame now. And I think that's a role that the private community organization partner can really play well.
Bob, I know that there was activism in your chapter as well, but I want to frame a question that came from one of our audience members before we wrap up, and it's about impact metrics and ways of thinking about impact. This is from Susan. Ways of thinking about impact that foundations can advance more effectively than other forms of economic development, and how these pathways might complement the advancement that investing in our entrepreneurial ecosystem can achieve. Can you help us think about impact in the ways Susan's encouraging us to consider it?
Sure. Is that a question to me?
It is for you, Bob.
At at the time, my chapter ends right at the sort of the beginning of the 21st century, and the impact that seems to have been largest at that point, if one would measure it, was to really shift a lot of the public's expectation that the giants of the past would somehow rescue us, right? Would cause revitalization, and you just need to hang in there. And yet shifted that expectation that, well, perhaps the future was in the hands of this sort of the image of heroic young entrepreneurs, who many of whom come from non-privileged backgrounds, but go through universities and technology. They can use technology to create a new economy and create a new social relations of economic growth that could perhaps be far more equitable and far less divisive than the era of before. Now we don't know yet how, we're still trying to figure out exactly how that played out over time, but it was very clear that by the mid 1990s, that image of an attractive, technology-driven future really became more and more ingrained in what people were thinking about when they think about the region's future. And in that bit, the foundations created that gift of belief, right? That the private enterprise system could actually evolve and give the region another comparably worldwide importance in its future, and create a more equitable path to prosperity for people who were still, and today still, struggle with the consequences of the demise of the previous regime.
Well, I have to say that this conversation just reminds me once again what a privilege it's been to work with these authors and with several others who have participated in previous podcast interviews and in another author convening earlier in our work together. Because, in fact, what you've done is you've cast a light on a subject that's often opaque. You've helped to expand and open the aperture on philanthropy in Pittsburgh. And you've shown us how time is an important component, how this long game, this long-term view of philanthropy and the ability to help transform Pittsburgh is another measure of the gift of belief of what everyday philanthropists with modest means and those with more significant means have meant to Pittsburgh over time. So I want to thank you all for your contributions, for your reminder that this is an ongoing story, and for our guests and attendees who are with us today. The book is out in paperback, and so we hope that this conversation today will encourage you to delve more deeply into the story of philanthropy in Pittsburgh and the gift of belief, the forging, philanthropy and the forging of Pittsburgh. So I thank you all, and with that, I wish you well. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.